Okay, well, thanks to Livable California for this opportunity to talk. Uh, I mean, I have a written version of what I'm going to say. Probably I'll digress from the script, but if you look at the chat thing, you'll see the text of what I would like to say and some of the points I probably will say. Okay, I'm going to begin with a few anecdotes. I've written this column weekly for probably 4 or 5 years. So there's tons of articles that I've written about planning issues in Los Angeles, a little bit about Sacramento, but mostly about Los Angeles. I document everything. I have lots of embedded links. I carefully research each article, and everything shows up on Google because I know when I try to look for articles when I'm writing, I see my own stuff that pops up on Google. Nevertheless, it has been years since I have ever been contacted by any reporter from a major newspaper. I was once contacted by Adam Nagurney from the New York Times, but it's been years since he or any other New York Times reporters. It's been years since anyone from the Los Angeles Times, where Jill used to work, has ever contacted me. I was contacted a few times by a talk radio station, and I even was on for an hour taking all kinds of questions, and then the line went dead. So it isn't that they don't know how to reach me. And that isn't that I don't have something to say, because I write something every week on issues in LA. It's that my theory is, and I'll elaborate on it, I think they're not interested in what I have to say, because I'm probably going to go implicate the elected officials at City Hall of being in the pocket of real estate industry, and I would elaborate that on great details. And I've heard the word prostitutes a lot, so I would argue that the reporters, and I'll try to explain why, pretty much follow in line with the publishers, and the publishers follow in line with an elite consensus that the era of federal intervention in housing issues through public housing is gone. I mean, the only two advocates I know of restoring public housing programs were Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. There was no one else in either party who ever raised these issues. So that's one personal anecdote. The other personal anecdote is I have a sister who is a journalist. She went the track of being the editor of her high school newspaper. She worked for the Daily Cardinal at the University of Wisconsin. She moved to New York. She worked her way up to become an editor of magazines. The magazine world collapsed. And my sister, I don't think she has a deep understanding of politics, but boy, she was successful as an editor because she could intuit what publishers wanted. And she made sure that when she was an editor, she made sure that all the articles delivered what the publishers wanted. And the final anecdote is I was contacted by someone who Jill probably knows, Allison Cohn. You must have worked with her at some time. She's now the editor of the Larchmont Buzz, or one of the little newspapers, throwaway newspapers in one of the neighborhoods of LA. And after she grilled me about different planning issues in LA, which is the first time any reporter or editor has done that in years, I said, okay, you've asked me questions. Now I want to ask you a question. What's the story? Oh, ask Los Feliz Ledger. Somebody, Amy Gustanich, has corrected me. Okay, so there's three local newspapers in Larchmont, and she's the editor of one of them. And she said she thought the explanation was that the newsrooms are short-staffed and people don't have a lot of time and so forth to go deeply into an article. And I'm sure that's part of it, but I think there is actually a lot more going on. Because, you know, if you have 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, you will examine and write about what's important. So if you have, regardless of the time, you will figure out a way to get to what's important. If Allison Cohn decided that she could track me down, and every article I write has my email, and I always list how to reach me. So I'm eminently reachable. Any reporter could do that, and it is. So let's see what is going on. I concluded a long time ago that I don't think the press is neutral. Some people think that they just reporters come in and they decide what they want to write, and they look at the full spectrum of topics and they just figure out, well, this is what I want to write and this is what I want to write about. Well, I don't think it works that way. I mean, Jill would know more because she worked on the inside. But as someone on the outside, they seem very blinkered in their view. And the Los Angeles Times in LA that I know quite well and that I write about all the times seems to be like that. And I put it like this: the public, the reporters try to get on the wavelength of the editors try to get on the wavelength of the publishers, and the publishers pretty much represent an elite consensus that the era of public programs raising the minimum wage is over, that if we're going to solve anything, it has to be through the private sector initiatives. For people who know the political science term, we call this neoliberalism. If you don't know that, you've certainly heard about supply side economics or trickle down economics. You've heard the term WIMBY, which I think Jill turned me on to, Wall Street in my backyard. I've lately heard a better term, which is faux-gressive. This is the philosophy that every social problem can be solved by giving the right amount of encouragement and handouts to the private sector. If you can just unleash them largely by eliminating competition from public agencies and eliminate restrictions that they have, such as zoning laws, planning laws, and environmental laws, they will bring forth an enormous amount of, in this case, housing. Some of that housing will trickle down to become affordable. And if you require that they have a certain amount of affordable housing, they will produce lots of affordable housing in order to produce market housing. I think all of these explanations and theories are total bunk. And I've challenged through my column again and again and again. I said, okay, show me where this is happening. Show me one neighborhood in LA in which affordable housing has appeared by filtering. They claim, well, it takes 25 years. Okay, show me where housing that was built in the 1990s is now affordable. And no one has ever been able to point that out. Or I point out, show me where building expensive housing has produced low-cost housing. Show me where that's happened. And we're talking about the second largest city in the United States. And no one has ever been able to identify a neighborhood or an address where these things are happening. So I know that this is just a story. It's a cover story. And this is what I argue repeatedly. It's easy to say you're concerned about affordable housing. This is the formula that we encountered in Measure S from a group called Abundant Housing LA, which is the Southern California, Los Angeles version of YIMBY, California. They always talked about how they were concerned about housing, and they refined their message by through big developers who funded their campaign. They hired a Democratic campaign firm based in Pasadena, Park Skelton, who some of you might know the name. They did focus groups. The focus groups determined that if you talk about housing and the need to build affordable housing, you can bamboozle people. And that's exactly what they did. And that type of bamboozling has continued to the present. And the local papers in LA, the local media, are totally part of this effort to bamboozle. So I've given up on any effort to try to get a truthful, it says if you voted for Measure S, you were misled. Yes, that's true, but it was a sophisticated effort to mislead it. If you voted for Measure S, you were misled, but we'll take that out later. Okay, I think I could totally disagree with that. Okay, so as I pointed out when I write my column in City Watch, every week I try to debunk the arguments that were given. Sometimes they're given by reporters. Sometimes they're given by these astroturf groups like Abundant Housing. Lately, a lot of them have been given by my colleagues and people I would now be working with in the Los Angeles Department of City Planning. And I always debunk it. And lately, I've even been called, I've been contacted for the first time in a long time by one of these abundant housing types, and he wants to argue with me. So I've been willing to argue with him. And I told him that he simply will, he can pursue all the efforts he wants to somehow find a magic formula that will allow the private sector to build public, low-cost housing. And I told him it's theoretically impossible. Investors build housing to make money, and there's no money to be made in this type of housing. You can't make money. You can't make a profit by investing in low-cost housing. It simply can't be done. And therefore it won't happen, and it hasn't happened, and it won't happen, and in the future it won't happen. Someone asked where we could subscribe to CityWatch. CityWatch, it's www.citywatch.com.org or .com, I forget, but it'll pop up through Google. And if you go to the bottom of the page, actually when you log on for the first time, you'll get a sign up box, and you can put your name in, and it'll be sent to your email inbox twice a week. And there's usually about a dozen articles in each issue, sometimes more, sometimes less. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the LA Times, since that's the newspaper of record in Los Angeles and would still like to be the newspaper of record in California. The newspaper was originally owned by the Chandler family. They were very involved in real estate, oil, other types of investments, and they were very politically conservative, and they used the newspaper as to be boosters. Basically, they were boosters of the real estate industry. Since in recent years, the newspaper has changed hands twice. It was bought by a real estate publisher from New York named Sam Zell. He largely tried to take advantage of the assets of the LA Times. He significantly downsized the paper's reporting staff. And then Dr. Patrick Schoen, is that his name? He's a surgeon in LA who's developed a lot of high medical technology. He was able to buy it. In terms of its broad coverage, it's a little bit more liberal than it used to be. But in terms of its real estate coverage, I can't detect any difference in the coverage of real estate and planning and zoning issues that was there during the era of Sam Zell or the many, many decades of when the Chandler family owned the newspaper. It was and remains a newspaper that is part of what Harvey Molich from UCS, or used to teach at UCSB, calls the urban growth machine. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. They are very much in the business now of figuring out how to keep this giant real estate bubble inflated. I think that sums up the LA Times. Even NPR public radio, they seem to be totally in line with it. I don't know too much about the other smaller newspapers, but they all seem to have the same attitude. And let me jump ahead, and we'll try to explain it. I mentioned Harvey Molich. Harvey Molich used to teach sociology at UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the person who developed the concept of the urban growth machine. Now, what some of you might have heard that term, others I'll explain it to. The urban growth machine means it's an axis. Who are the people who are in the urban growth machine? Of course, you have the chambers of commerce, you have all the real estate people, the investors, the developers, the real estate agents, the contractors, the subcontractors. They're all in the business of real estate, investing in it, building it, renting it, managing it, reselling it, speculating in it. Then you have the construction unions. You have the politicians who they fund, and mostly in California, they're from the Democratic Party, the corporate wing, which is the dominant wing of the Democratic Party. And Harvey Mollich says the press is part of it, that the press is not doing serious reporting. They're largely there to keep this real estate bubble inflated. And there's another book which I'll recommend to people, which will give a fuller explanation. Here, let's see, is it popping up? I can't. I'm not, well, it doesn't seem to pop up on the screen, but it's called Capital City. It's written by Samuel Stein, who I've met. It's called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. He's a young scholar in New York City. He got a master's in Hunter College, and he's now in the Graduate School of City College of New York. And his thesis is simply that the urban planning field and local government is an accessory to the real estate industry. And the main tool that they have is no longer urban renewal, which is using the power of local government to acquire large blocks of property through eminent domain, compiling larger blocks of property, and then being able to provide it to the private sector to build office buildings, apartment houses, shopping centers, and so forth. He said the new model that they have is upzoning. When you upzone property, and that's the essence of what Wiener does, and Tony Atkins in Sacramento, and the legislators or the members of the city council and the elected officials in a city like LA, upzoning increases the value of real estate. If you can build 10 units through SB 9 or SB 10, rather than 1 unit and a couple accessory dwelling units on a residential parcel, the value goes up significantly. When the value goes up, it creates instant wealth and a windfall for the property owners, and it creates enormous opportunities for people who don't simply want to flip their property, who would like to build expensive housing. And he said this is exactly how the planning profession has evolved. It's moved, rather than moving block by block as they did by urban renewal, they now move lot by upzoning. It achieves the same end, which is to transform older property that's underperforming, in their term, meaning it's not producing enough profit, into newly profitable buildings. And we see in a city like Los Angeles, we see this selectively happening in many neighborhoods. So if people want to do a deeper dive into this, I would recommend you look at Harvey Mollich's book, which is called Urban Fortunes. It's an old book, but it's still extremely valuable. Or if you want to read something newer, there's Samuel Stein's book, Capital City. And they make great bookends, and you will be able to get a good understanding of exactly how this process of upzoning works, and the role of the media in it. Now I'm going to jump ahead, and I'll try to leave a lot of time for questions about, well, where does that leave us? And and if you look at the text that I posted at the top of the chat, I tried to outline some of the options that are still available. I think it might be possible occasionally to get an article in the corporate media, but mostly the good stuff is in the letters to the editor. That seems to be the one place where they allow critical content. So I know when I read the LA Times, I always make a point of reading the letters to the editor, because often you'll see points and arguments there, including about planning and zoning issues, that you'll never see in the actual news stories or editorial stories in the paper. I'm a strong believer in alternative media. I write for City Watch. I used to write before for Ron Kay's LA. Ron was the editor of a smaller former newspaper in LA called the Daily News. He was pushed out, and he took his skills as an investigative reporter to create a website, Ron Kay's LA, and he would occasionally allow guest articles, which is where I started. and I gradually shifted over to City Watch in New York. I mean, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, you have 48 Hills, which is probably better than City Watch. And some people tell, and I'm sure there's other publications, maybe in the chat, people can talk about other smaller publications. Plus, there's always social media. I repost everything I write on many different sites on Facebook. I've compiled a list of people I know who are interested, so I must have at least 600 people who I mail copies of my articles out to. I don't like Twitter, but I've taken to putting my stuff up on Twitter. You have Instagram. I know I have a daughter, she's big on Instagram. It's kind of generational, but that's another source. And probably there's other things. Someone asked if I could, I see Tess Taylor said repost Dick's points in the chat. Latecomers might have missed it. My points are at the top of the chat. So if you go to the top of the chat, you'll see it, but I'll post it at the end as well. And I sent copies of it to Jill. So Jill will be able to send it out to anyone who was on this call, who you could do it. Okay, so we have the alternative media, and we don't have the quantity that we have through the corporate media, but at least you have more quality. And there's another question of what is the message that we should try to deliver. And some people might disagree with me, but I don't think the message ought to be we want to preserve local control. And let me explain it. There's a lot of baggage that comes with this argument for local control. It used to be called states' rights. States' rights was basically a local control argument. We want the right to have a slave. So when you talk about local control, you have to, there's the baggage that comes with it. And also white citizen councils talked about local control, the right to oppose desegregation in housing and employment and public accommodations. And quite frankly, there's a lot of things that I support that are imposed on local cities. I support planning. In the state of California, no city has the right to say, we reserve our right of local control and we do not want to have a general plan. We do not want to monitor our plans. We don't want to put reports into Sacramento. This is required by state law. So what is the, what then is the alternative argument? And the argument that I make again and again and again through my City Watch columns is these things don't work. They are giveaways to developers, and the goals that they have of increasing low-priced housing, building affordable housing, and increasing transit ridership simply doesn't work. You cannot achieve these goals. So I again and again point out that it makes social problems that they claim to fix worse. It doesn't do it. And this is what I explain. When you upzone property, which is the main approach of Wiener, Tony Atkins, and all the local legislation, it increases the value of land. When you increase the value of land, private developers have to pay more to acquire that land. And when they have to pay more in acquisition costs, they have to recover it, and they want to make a profit. And you might be surprised that private investors through new residential real estate expect to make 15 to 20% per year in returns. And this isn't a number I made up. I heard this at a course at USC where I used to teach, in a course on real estate. And the exercises were given by a guy named Mott Smith, who's a planner and a developer. And he made it clear that when the exercises he gave in class, you had to have things pencil out to what is the accepted rate of return on new residential real estate, 15 to 20%. As a result, all of this new residential real estate is expensive. And when it's expensive, only people who are upper income can afford the rents. And we know from anyone who's studied mass transit ridership, these people rarely, if ever, take mass transit. There are a few early adapters, maybe 1 in 100. I have friends who live in some of these fancy buildings, easily accessible to transit. And they say they're the only people in the building who take transit. Everyone else has a car. And if they don't drive their own car, then they depend on Uber and Lyft. So you're not going to be able to maintain, you're not going to be able to achieve mass transit ridership by building expensive housing. And you're not going to be able to build affordable housing by building expensive housing. And then they have the argument, well, we will require developers to include low-income housing. Now, I don't know about other cities, but I can tell you about Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, no one from the city's Department of Housing and Community Investment ever inspects any of this low-priced housing that developers pledge to include. They have to have it in their deed. They call it deed restricted housing. But one investigative reporter in LA, John Schwada, actually decided to go out and do his own independent investigation. And he went to a number of sites that had what's called density bonus housing. And when he went to it, the property managers knew nothing about these low-cost units. They simply didn't exist. And if a landlord wants to find out who has been vetted to be a tenant in low-cost housing, there's no registry, no public registry. I've heard they're beginning to process it, but in the city of LA, the Housing and Community Investment Department has never developed a registry of tenants, and they've never developed a registry of eligible units. So if you are low income and you would like to live in one of these things, it's up to you to find it. There is no public agency which will tell you where to find it. They have contracted with a company in North Carolina that will help you find low-priced housing, but there is no one in the city of LA that I know of that compiles a registry or that ever goes out and inspect it. And the result is this is mostly phantom housing, phantom low-income housing. It doesn't really exist. And when you look at the city of LA's statistics, you have to look carefully. They always talk about permits. They don't talk about units that were built and units that were occupied by low-income people. So on one hand, the city claims it's producing low-income housing by issuing building permits, which are often never built. I read one article that said there is a backlog of 100,000 building permits for low-income housing that have never been built. I don't know if I've never double-checked that number, but that tells you that a lot of the developers simply make the promise that they'll build it in order to be able to build larger, taller, denser buildings, often without sufficient parking or yards. So that would be it. I have a lot of other points, but I think at this point I would prefer to shut up and take a lot of questions. Unless you want me to talk more, I will, but if not, I'd rather take questions.